Recently, I was at a small group at my church, and a woman had just been to a kid's birthday party. She wasn't the host, and she was invited to be a part of the celebration. And as she sat there, as all the kids played around her, she noticed that there was a 3-year-old girl that came up to the table, attracted by all the treats, and indeed a big birthday cake. Then the adults looked on, some with horror, as the 3-year-old made her way around to that cake and swiped it and got icing all in her fingers. In that moment, there was not a sense of what to do, except that the employees of the pizza parlor came along and scooped up that little girl and took her back to her parents. As the church members sat there with the other adults, there was a question about who was responsible in tending this girl, and there were negative assumptions made about her and her family. They didn't speak English. As my church member related this story back to us, it was obvious that it was unsettling to her. As we sat there, another member of the group, a former teacher, helped us all consider a new frame. She said, I would have gotten down at the eye level of that 3-year-old girl and offered her some of that cake to take back to her family. We all came up with ideas, I know, we said out loud and harbored them in our own hearts about why that wasn't the thing to do, too illogical. For one thing, the cake hadn't even been cut. The birthday child hadn't even gotten a chance. Another is, what kind of message do you want to send a child about where she shouldn't be and what she shouldn't touch? Also, my church member admitted freely that she was not the host of the party. She was there by the invitation of others, and it wasn't her right in order to pass out what wasn't hers to give. All these are true. We can come up with even more logical reasons why this child shouldn't have the cake. But we felt it there in that small group, and I feel it now even as I share this story again, that when we get in touch with what it means to think outside of our logical bounds, to get in touch with our hearts, that it's then that we have the opportunity to most feel the flow of grace as it is available to us, and how it informs us about how we can be a channel of God's grace, sometimes so far outside of our own expectations. I don't know about you, but it's when I'm willing and able to let go of things, my possessions, my status, my success. It's then that I really truly open myself up to what God can do through me, through grace. God's grace is so abundant that John Wesley had a way of identifying this motion in our lives. 3 of these descriptors he uses are prevenient grace, justifying grace, sanctifying grace. Prevenient grace, it comes before. It's the grace that was with that 3-year-old girl in her mother's womb, long before she got to that birthday table. There she was, feeling and experiencing an abundance of which she was attracted to. We could say that that was tapping in to that larger sense of what it means to be the Imago Dei, what it means to be the image of God's goodness, so much bigger than ourselves, and yet we can live it out through ourselves, through that divine spark that was within us. Each of us has this pull. It's a universal call, this prevenient grace. It's not exempt from anybody. It's that kind of irresistible love that entices us into further relationship with God. And the offer of the suggested reading I have from Will Willimon, he quotes John Wesley, grace for all, grace in all. That means grace for all is that universal call, that everybody is open and welcome to receive the love of God. Grace in all. We are all called to be vessels of that love. And yet we find that there's so much that could lead us to feel that we are separated from God. Justifying grace calls us forward from all the things that would separate us. We define sin as anything that would separate us from the love of our Creator. Certainly the sinfulness that comes is all that gets in the way. Sometimes it's from within, and sometimes it's the experiences that we have from without. It's a world in which there's much violence, a world in which we can experience broken relationships and hatred and not know how to respond. Maybe we feel guilt or shame. But we know too that God is ready and available to meet us in those places, those intersections in which we don't feel connected to that original source of our eternal love. And we look for ways in people that could identify that original source. John Wesley was always trying to be in touch with that. For him, it was overcoming some of the logical means and the head means of what he knew by Scripture and knew through his study, but was yet to feel fully upon his heart. In his Aldersgate moment, many years into his ministry, he was hearing a preface to the Epistle to the Romans read, one that was written by Luther. As somebody was reading it out loud, inexplicably, his heart was strangely warmed. All of a sudden, he knew that love of his Creator fully and completely. And he knew as well that anything that he had done, anything that caused him to feel separate from God, anything he'd put in the way particularly, was forgiven. Forgiveness, as we experience it through Christ, puts us in touch and in solidarity with the suffering of the world. Because we know that we've been forgiven no matter what, in spite of what it is that we might allow to get in the way, we recognize outwardly all the places in which that reconciling action and love and justifying grace is still at work. Because Christ is incarnate, God, taking on human flesh, the one that chose to be with the poor and oppressed, chose to go to uncomfortable places, and chose to take on the shape of the cross. In that boundless love, there was a reopening and a reawakening of that original Creator love that is in and for all creation. It was in that moment that indeed John Wesley was converted. Conversion meaning experiencing the full liberating love of God and allowing it to reach you wholeheartedly. We find too that this process doesn't end for John Wesley at Aldersgate, and it doesn't end for us once we've truly felt the forgiveness of God. Because God is ongoingly forgiving us for those things that we would continue to allow to get in the way. We can be leading ourselves into all kinds of things that would lead us away from what God would have us do. And yet that sanctifying Spirit of God meets us again and again at the tables and stories of which we find ourselves. And it's at those tables that we have the opportunity to become more perfect in God's love, to remember whose we are, to remember the sacrifice that Christ has made, opening God's love up to us, and genuinely the universal call we all have to be a part of God's ongoing, loving creation. So I embody this sanctifying grace when I don't allow the things that I have in place to get in the way. Sometimes that means things even in the church. Sometimes that means things within my own denomination, the United Methodist Church. It means that I keep finding myself at the unsettled places in which we wrestle together because we are still figuring it out. And there's still so much of our own things that could get in the way of the free flow of God's ongoing grace. But the world needs it. We need it. We need it because there's so many birthday tables at which we might be bystanders. There's so many ways in which we might rise up from the love that is upon our hearts and embody that love for little girls, for those who can't otherwise make it. We know a table of grace and a table of plenty that is set out before us. There are many rules and regulations that we might have, many statutes we might put around who can be at that table, and whether even we're worthy to receive. And yet I recall that 3-year-old girl who was attracted to the abundance of that birthday table. And out of that attraction, she sensed the abundance of grace that could meet her. And we, as we surround her in that, perhaps as we meet her in our own sense of childlike wonder, we have the opportunity to defy logic and to live into the wholehearted nature of God's grace, to meet her hunger with our love, and in so doing, fully meet the love of the one who has created us.